everyone, and welcome to another episode of Shoes Off Inside One-on-One. And today I decided that this topic needed to be talked about because it is the topic that seems to be on all the airwaves and sort of very pervasive right now, because we are at a war right now between the US and China when it comes to trade, and it is having devastating impacts. But I don't think a lot of people really understand, sort of the ins and outs of this particular issue and how big and dangerous it is. So I decided to call upon a friend of mine, long, old time friend of mine. We go way back. Yeah, Eric Olander. He is a dear friend of mine from we knew each other
CNN days, mid
first.
90s. If you want to feel old, you and I were on the Great Wall of China together with your little stepladder doing a stand-up. And I was with the Associated Press. You were with CNN. And that was, I think, 1995 when we
It
first
was
met.
1990 because that's when I first started at CNN when I was the Tokyo correspondent.
That's right.
But yeah, so Eric and I have worked at CNN together. We worked at CNBC together. Right. But Eric has been the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project, right? And it's an independent, nonpartisan media initiative that really kind of tracks China relations with the developing countries, right?
That's
and
right.
So he is the person I thought of when I thought to myself, okay, I want to do an episode that really is kind of an explainer in terms of what's going on here with US-China relations, but also the rest of Asia as well. And I thought of you, Eric. So
wonderful. Well, it is fantastic to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So it's great to. I've had so much fun watching your shows over the years, from Singapore now to here, and what you're doing with Kelly and the crew. And it's really an honor to be here. I feel like I'm on the Asian View. I
know. Like I said, this is Shoes Off Inside One-on-One, where I just do an interview with one person. Kelly and Tamlin take a rest. But again, I just felt like this is such an important issue because of what's going on right now.
And unfortunately, in the United States, the discourse is highly distorted about China. And again, my role in all of this is never to persuade anybody of anything. China good, China bad. I'll leave that up to other people. We just have to look at again, some facts and kind of frame it. So I heard, the guy, Kevin, I forget his name, from Shark Tank.
Kevin O'Leary.
Kevin O'Leary on Shark Tank. And he was on CNBC yesterday kind of saying, Xi Jinping is in Southeast Asia, but Southeast Asia doesn't matter compared to the United States. The United States is the big prize.
I watched that interview.
Okay, but here's the facts.
Yeah.
The fact is that China does twice as much trade with Southeast Asia than it does with the United States. $924 billion with Southeast Asia compared to $500 billion with the United States. The United States is still major, but it's important to understand that there's a lot of misinformation that is floating around China that gives a very distorted understanding of the nature of this trade war. And we are in a trade war.
Yeah, we are.
There's no doubt. It's in a war. That's right.
Yeah, and it's, tit for tat, but, millions, hundreds of millions of lives are being affected by this and will be. So let's get to the heart of it, right?
Yeah.
This misunderstanding that you're talking about, I think that is hugely problematic. But unfortunately, it's coming from the very top, Donald Trump. Right. So again, we want to inform people. We don't want to take sides here, but let's just state facts.
But it is surprisingly a bipartisan issue in Washington. This is one of the few issues that Democrats and Republicans, and the Democrats haven't been much better in terms of on China, in terms of the accuracy of the information. And again, a lot of people may listen to this and say, well, you're a panda hugger and you're pro CCP. And no, that's not it. Again, just looking at the data as it is. And again, so this is one of those rare issues in American politics today where there is some consistency between the two parties.
Yeah. So the lack of thorough information when it comes to China and the lack of understanding. So that's why I wanted to do this podcast. Yeah. So where do you see the biggest issue when it comes to this sort of gap in understanding China when it comes to global sort of relations and also with US? Why is it that there's been this gaping misunderstanding? And then obviously Donald Trump has taken full advantage of really Americans not being aware enough of this the trade imbalance and how it works and what it takes to kind of maintain this relationship. So there's
So
just so much there.
yeah, so I'm going to take us back to the mid 90s when you and I were in Beijing for that women's conference. And that's
Yes.
around the time when everything started, which is when China became a member of the WTO
Yep.
and the World Trade
Or
Organization.
trade.
And there was this expectation that Americans had after the end of the Cold War. Remember, this was the end of history. We won the Cold War. And we had this expectation that that's it. Everybody wants to be like us. And if you open and if you modernize and if you liberalize, you will then become more democratic. That was the assumption. And so there was this idea that we brought China into the World Trade Organization. And we had this idea. Remember, Bill Clinton was advocating that the more that they open to the West and the more that we engage them in trade,
Yep.
they will become like us.
Mhm.
And for a moment, for a time, there was some optimism that that was actually going to happen. I remember when I was living in Beijing and I could get YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. Hard to believe today that that was even possible at one point,
Right.
but it was possible for a brief moment. And so there's been this real crushing disappointment by the Americans that the Chinese went a radically different path. That
Mhm.
not only did they not liberalize, they became far more authoritarian. They cracked down.
Yep.
Xi Jinping took it into a much more kind of hardcore, hardline direction. And there
Definitely.
was this active rejection of the American order and the American system. And at the same time, as this was happening, the United States, Bill Clinton again, was signing free trade agreements. And we had this idea rooted in Ronald Reagan that, open borders, low taxes, free trade, open borders and trade, not in migration. And so we brought tariffs down to nothing. And we thought at that time, the more we trade, the better off we are. Okay.
Mhm.
So two things were happening in the 90s. China is starting to become this manufacturing powerhouse. And at the same time, American companies are leaving the Rust Belt, leaving the
Yep.
South, leaving the United States, looking for cheaper manufacturing opportunities, and at the same time, eyeing this market of 1 billion people as
Right.
a potential consumer market.
Right.
Let's fast forward now to where we are today. And you hear this quite a bit in, again, Republican and Democrat kind of frustrations with China that not only did they not do what we wanted them to do,
Mm.
they perverted the system. They stole intellectual property. They abused the free trade. Now, the problem is with a lot of this thinking, and I don't think there's any dispute that China is a prolific theft, steal, a robber of intellectual property.
Right. Right. That's a
Okay.
fact.
We've got, the Chinese really perverting in many ways the trade system. And at the same time, we've got American companies greedily looking to lower labor costs, to lower environmental costs, to lower labor protections. And they're not only
100%.
going to China, they're
Yeah.
going to all over the world looking for
Yes.
profits. And
Yes.
this is what brings us to the fallacy in the American argument that the Chinese have ripped off the Americans.
Mhm.
Because when you look at a pair of Nikes or you look at an Apple phone, about 1 or 2% of that value sits in China in the manufacturing side. The rest of that value is captured by the American side. So when
Mhm.
they say designed in Cupertino, manufactured in China, that is actually saying 2% of the value for the manufacturing is in China, 98% of the value is captured in Cupertino,
Right.
broadly speaking. Okay. And same, here in Southeast Asia when manufacturing the shoes. You go to a Foot Locker today, a pair of Nikes cost $150. How
Mhm.
much of that do you think is captured by the Vietnamese labor of that?
Right.
Almost nothing.
It's
This
probably
is why
more
it's
than the
lunacy by bringing the manufacturing back, because that's the lowest margin part of the business, is actually putting the leather and the string together to
Yeah.
make the
Yeah,
shoe.
yeah. No,
And so
and that's been spoken about somewhat, and people are trying to educate the average American here, saying, "Do you understand that the cost of putting the same product together here, what Donald Trump is claiming he's going to bring all the manufacturing back, the
totally
cost is
prohibitive.
going it's completely cost prohibitive, right?"
Oh, but there's other costs though, and this is why again this argument about fairness is wrong. In Xi'an, China, yesterday, the
Mhm.
AQI, which is the air quality index, was north of 500.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Explain
Here
why
in
that's
Southeast
yeah,
Asia,
yeah.
we've got very expensive. I have had to spend almost $800 on air purifiers because the air quality index here is about 200, oftentimes 150 to 200 in Vietnam. In northern Vietnam, it's even higher some days. Okay, now the reason why is that those are all the factories that are making all the crap that shows up in Walmart and Target and Kohl's and everywhere else. So we look at the Americans don't want air quality that's 400 or 500 the way it is here in Southeast Asia. India is even worse. Bangladesh is suffering that as well. So there's another cost that's born.
Right.
The third cost that's born, which again we have to take into account, is that manufacturing is incredibly hard on the body. And I think it's been a long time since a lot of Americans have stepped foot into a factory. And again, Dave Chappelle was right. We don't want to make the Nikes. We want to wear the Nikes. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that you see about people who've worked in factories for 5, 6, 7 years, first of all, many of them are young, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are working in the factories. And contrary to the rhetoric, it's not slave conditions. If you go into a Nike factory today, or the iPhone factory, these are very modern, very efficient, very clean factories. They're under, they have a lot of supervision, because there's a lot of rights groups and others who are very skeptical about the working conditions. I've been to a number of the factories here in Southeast Asia. I've spent time in the factories in China. This myth that they're slave-like is just, again, it's just not informed.
Okay, so, but I think because these myths still exist, these stories still exist about the slave-like conditions, because I think people base it on the wages, right? The wages are
the wages are much lower here.
dramatically lower, right?
That's
And
right.
I'm sure the average American is like, how can anybody live on that? Well, it's different, right? Because cost of living is very different in these places where these factories are, et cetera, et cetera. But it's because of all this misinformation that builds the story.
That's right. And wages in China, for example, have been rising steadily, in part because China has a declining population. The cost of labor has been going up. Environmental regulations in China have been increasing. And so the cost of production in China has actually gone up, which is one of the reasons why Chinese manufacturers have been leaving China, looking to Southeast Asia, looking to South America, looking to Africa and other parts of the world in order to lower their costs. They're doing the same thing that, we did 20 years ago, because the costs are going up. So if it costs $500-600 a month or even more, maybe $1,000 a month for a worker in China, it's $300 a month here in Southeast Asia. So that is, and again, and this $300 a month sounds like slave-like conditions if your base of reference is Orange County. But when you're here in Southeast Asia, and this is per capita income is 5,000. It's a footstep out of agriculture. And one of the things that a lot of people in developing countries will tell you is that working farms and working agriculture in subsistence, kind of conditions is brutally difficult. And so getting a factory job and putting you inside is actually a step up out. First of all, you get meals. Many of the factories oftentimes provide maternal benefits. They sometimes will provide, some time off. They do provide some benefits. Again, these slave-like conditions are the extremes. Do they exist? Of course they exist. Is the majority of what we buy in Walmart and Target made under slave-like conditions? Absolutely not. That's just not the way it works. And so for a lot of young people, they can earn, for 5 or 6 years, they bust their asses. They earn enough to either kind of, send money back to their parents, or to get a start in life, and then they move back to their villages and their countries, into the countryside. But they have a little bit of money. But working in factories is not something that people can really do for more than 10 years, oftentimes because of the toll it takes on your body.
So let's switch this conversation just a little bit. Talk about, you're in Vietnam, you live in Ho Chi Minh City, you've been there for many, many years. And I'm just curious what you're hearing about this trade war and how people are feeling. What are you hearing on the ground about this trade war that Donald Trump has started?
So when the 46% tariff number came out, people were shocked. I mean, that was nothing what they expected. People were expecting 20%, 25%, because those are the kinds of numbers that they'd seen with Mexico and Canada and some others. 46%. I mean, the blood drains from your head when you think about what that is, because think about it this way. If again, a Nike pair of shoes, $100 pair of Nikes now costs $150 $150.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not possible. That people aren't going to spend 46% more on the shrimp, the coffee. By the
Mm-hmm.
way, Vietnam is the second largest coffee producer in
Coffee
the world
maker.
behind
People
Brazil.
don't. People
So
don't
when
understand.
you,
People don't
yeah,
realize.
when you go to Safeway and to to Ralph's and you're going to go buy Nescafe or one of the kind of the over, that's a lot of Vietnamese coffee in
Yep.
there. That would
Yep.
be 46% more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there was shock. I mean, and the word that I heard from a number of stakeholders here was people were traumatized to think about what the implications of this could be.
Mm-hmm.
And the symbolism that this is happening in the month of April in 2025
Let's
is
talk
very
about that.
important
Let's talk about why.
because in Hanoi right now and in Ho Chi Minh City, they are preparing the city for the 50th anniversary for the end of the war,
Yeah, the Vietnam War.
the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
or the American War,
the
or the
American
War of
War. Yes,
Reunification.
that's right.
And the fact that this is happening at this moment in time it provoked a lot of emotion. So one emotion was anger of like, hell no, we did this already a half century ago and here we are again.
Yeah,
Another emotion was fear of this could lead to mass unemployment. We're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs, potentially millions of jobs that could be rendered, just made redundant
yeah,
very quickly. When these factories leave, they literally can pack up and go overnight, it feels like. I mean, it takes
wow,
them time, but Nike has hundreds of thousands of employees in Vietnam.
wow.
And Nike is not going to necessarily pay 46% more. It
Yeah,
would have,
no way,
okay. I mean,
no
it's
way.
just not viable for Nike to pay 446% more. So Nike then starts looking at places on that tariff list that is lower tariffs to be able to move. Because
Right,
Nike has an obligation to its shareholders to do that. Nike
right.
does not have an obligation to Vietnam to stick the course.
So, is
So
there a feeling of betrayal by
there
folks
is
over there?
remember, let's go back a little. I'm going to little more history.
Mm-hmm.
2018, well, actually, it was even, yeah, actually 2016, sorry, when Donald Trump first came
First
back
term.
into power.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Remember the first day that he was in office, one of the first things that he did was he pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
yep.
Okay. Vietnam and a number of Asian countries were pissed about that because they bent over backwards to accommodate one US demand after another, and
Mm-hmm.
they were left at the altar. Now, there's a lesson in what happened with TPP for the current moment now. So people were very, very angry
Mm-hmm.
that you made us go through all of these hoops, you made us do all of this stuff, and now you walk away. Okay, then what ended up happening was within a few months, all of the members of the TPP, now it's called the CPTPP, got
Mm-hmm.
together and said, should we throw this away or should we keep going?
Mm.
And they agreed to keep going.
Going.
And then the United States wanted to get back into the TPP at one point. Everyone went, nope, we're good.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. And that should be a very sobering lesson for the current moment now, is that the world can reconfigure very, very quickly. And so there
Don't
was
you think it's happening? It's
it
happening,
is, and we'll get to
right?
that. But let me just
Yeah.
tell you a little bit about. So Vietnam was very, very, and there's even today you hear in conversations with scholars and think tank analysts and
Mhm.
others about like TPP left a bitter taste in our mouth.
Yeah.
So for this to come again, well, that is still has a bitter taste in people's mouths, is even more. So the trust level went down. However, Vietnam's in a very precarious position. Okay. The United States is one of the country's largest export markets.
Mm.
It's one of the largest sources of FDI. It cannot be, just arrogant, say, like, okay, F you, Donald Trump, we don't
Yeah.
need you anymore. They're not in that position to do that.
Yeah.
And so they have to walk this incredibly delicate balance where they have to engage China because, again, they're on the border of China. China's one of their largest investors. They depend on China for water, electricity. It's a major food, market for them. Any number of issues and again, they're a border with China, and they have a tense, awkward, controversial, contentious, uncomfortable relationship with China that dates back thousands of years.
Right.
Okay, a lot like the complicated relationship that the U.S. and Mexico have.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to not alienate the dragon, and at the same time, they've got the eagle now that's clawing into their neck. And so they're in a tough position. Cambodia, Malaysia, all of them in this part of the world are also facing that equally delicate balance where they cannot alienate either one of the great powers.
Right, right. So when it comes to China, then,
Yeah,
okay, China is the biggest, and they are obviously now, dealing with the US directly, and they have a lot of influence, right? Let's be honest. Like you said, the trade with China and Southeast Asia is bigger
almost double.
than with the US, right?
Yeah,
So China is not blinking. And
no,
China has become extremely offended by the rhetoric coming from the US, namely J.D. Vance, vice president, who called them peasants. And that set off a firestorm in China. And
yeah,
so there's this growing nationalism that has become seemingly stronger than ever
yeah.
because of this trade war. What does that mean in terms of where this is going to go? Because Xi Jinping, he's not going to give in. He can't.
No. And so again, we're going to rewind the clock. This time we'll take it back to 2012. Xi Jinping comes into power.
Mhm.
Xi Jinping, in many ways, was a compromise candidate for for them to pick to be the
Yeah.
next leader. They did not expect that Xi would be the kind of leader that he is.
Mm.
But at the same time, Xi is a what they call a princeling. His
Mm.
Xi Zhongxun is his father, was one of the lieutenants for Mao Zedong. In many ways, again, Xi and Trump have a lot of similarities. They're both princelings in many respects. Both are, in my view, are marginally educated. They
Yeah.
have these very paranoid kind of views of the world, not
Yes.
very well read oftentimes,
True.
and again, very hyper nationalistic in that respect, and then surround themselves with loyalists
Yes,
more
sir.
than experts.
Mhm.
So interesting that he comes to power on a very nationalist idea of we're never going to go back to where we were. Okay.
Mhm.
And in many ways, it's a make China great again type of initiative. And he had something called the China Dream that was his main platform and his main campaign early on in his administration. And a lot of it was rooted in this century of humiliation, what the Chinese call, which is that when Western powers in Japan exploited China and colonized China.
Mm.
And the Chinese have, again, colonialism is a stain on history. It was brutal, it was violent, and again, despite what a lot of people will say in terms of revisionist history, it did not bring benefits to people. It was horrific. Here in Vietnam, the French colonials sold opium to pay for 40% of the budget. It was extraordinarily violent.
Mm.
And so the Chinese, and again, the Chinese and Japanese have never fully resolved their historical tensions.
Yeah.
And
No.
the Chinese Communist Party has nursed these grievances to great effect over the years, to
Mhm.
the point where Xi comes in and says, we're never going back.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we come to this moment, that's been building over the past 10 years, really, because again, history didn't start with Trump.
Mhm.
The pressure from the Americans has been steadily growing as the Americans have become increasingly disillusioned with China, and now that American companies aren't making enough money, or that the American Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, was the last kind of ballast in this relationship, and they've been like, you know what, we're done. We're not
Yeah.
making much money. Our members are kind of being frustrated. So now there's really no more guardrail left in terms of keeping this relationship going down the wrong path as it is right now. So we have this situation where, Biden really, in many ways, turned the vices on China in far more terrifying ways for the Chinese than Trump did. The first Trump years were very good to the Chinese, actually. The Chinese made huge expansions in their influence in Africa and South America as Trump kind of pulled back from the world. And so,
Mm.
in many respects, that was very helpful. Also, Trump has questioned a lot of the security alliances that have been a matrix around China. And in fact, just 2 years ago, Xi Jinping said that he was anxious about being surrounded by the American security network.
Mhm.
And so Biden, when he came in, he tightened the relationship with Japan. He kind of repaired the South Korean Japanese tensions that had started to evolve. He doubled down on the Philippines. He committed to Taiwan's defense. Remember, Biden 3 times said, will you defend Taiwan?
Yeah.
Biden said unambiguously, breaking from U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity, and said, yes, we will. All of that made China very, very nervous. So now we are in this moment where all of that is kind of fading away in many respects. The alliances are coming undone. The question of whether the US will protect Taiwan, Trump has been on record saying, maybe, maybe not.
Right.
Even South Korea and Japan, he's saying we're getting ripped off by them. And so now with this trade war, the Chinese feel that they are once again have got a boot on their neck. And this is tapping into those historical kind of resentments of the West that they've been kind of building over the past 20 years that Xi has been very effective at nursing. And so Xi cannot accede to the United States, even if he wanted to, which there's no indication he does.
Right.
And so there's a thinking now in China of like, if you want to do this, let's do this. Let's break up. You want it?
Okay.
You've been talking about decoupling now for 10 years?
Right.
Okay, let's do it. You want it? Let's do it. We're ready to go.
Let me ask you this, Eric, because I had put out this video last week, maybe it was about a week ago, where I put it simply, and tell me if I was accurate or not, that the Chinese tolerance for pain is very high.
It is.
And so
the Vietnamese is too.
Yeah, and I think the Koreans are. Like, I can say that sort of when it comes to Asians in general, I think, again, I hate making blanket statements like this, but I think the tolerance for pain is quite high. So therefore, they're willing to stick it out. They will stick it out long term.
Think about this. Your mother's generation and every parent at my son's school here in Vietnam came out of an era of famine, of war, of deprivation, of occupation. And some, their grandparents who are still alive here in Vietnam, remember French colonialism. Okay?
Yep.
They never want to go back to that, which is one of the reasons why they push their kids so hard in school, because they say, I will be damned if my children suffer the way I went through.
100%.
And so it's one of these mistakes that, people make, particularly in the West, when they see, the typical Korean or Chinese parent, which is just the tiger mom pushing. But one of the reasons that is being done is fear. And the fear is that they have in their day, their memory bank, what their childhood was like. And there is not a child, there's not a parent here in this country that was spared any of that. And your mother's generation in Korea was the same.
Oh, okay. She still has memories.
There's not a single parent, anyway, over 50. And again, we're at the 50th, I'm 55, and this is the 50th anniversary of the war. So after the war in Vietnam from 1975, things didn't get better. There was famine in this country in the 90s. I remember in Hong Kong, remember the Vietnamese boat people?
Oh, yeah.
People were fleeing Vietnam in the 90s, showing up on the shores all across Asia because there was bloated bellies here in this country.
Yeah.
Okay, so these memories of hardship are not ancient.
They're pretty fresh. Yeah,
they're pretty fresh.
Yeah.
And so that has built a tolerance. And also we talk about the tolerance for pain, the amount that people are willing to work. So we talk about these factories, we talk about the difficult life and even the farmers and the agricultural sector here. Conditions that I think most Americans would never understand.
Let's go back to that question then. So if China is willing to stick it out for however fucking long it takes, to win this, is that going to be the case? There's Xi Jinping and China is like, nope.
Yeah.
Let's rumble and let's see, may the best country win.
They already, in this part of the world, the leaders, including Xi and Prime Minister Chin here in Vietnam, have been bracing their people that this may be what it comes to. Okay. And so the Prime Minister here in Vietnam said very clearly, they said, we're going to do our best to negotiate with the Americans, but if it doesn't work, we're going to have to then, basically find a new way through it. And the code in that is get ready for some hard times. Right. And they're starting to prepare their people for this because, again, we're in a 90-day pause right now.
Right. Correct. Yeah.
There is no guarantee that we come on the other end of this 90-day pause. Right. No matter how well the Vietnamese, Malaysians, Cambodians negotiate with the Americans, that they get a reprieve of the 46% tariff, right? Mm-hmm. So they are now actively bracing their populations that we may not come out of this on a good way.
Right.
And in China, it's interesting that among the youth, there's a lot more nationalism, particularly online.
Oh,
And
yeah,
so
the
there's,
TikTok videos? Oh my
yeah,
god,
I mean,
the trolling?
between
It's
the
amazing.
trolling, but even domestically in China, there's a lot of like, and that creates political pressure for Xi.
I would
There's a
think so.
misnomer in the West that because it's an authoritarian government that's not democratic, that he has no political and public pressure. He does
Right.
face public pressure.
Oh, no, for sure.
And the attitude in China today is very much F this, let's do this,
Yeah.
and there's a sense that the Chinese are better positioned than the Americans are. 71% of all Amazon products are made in China. Okay, we are about to see a fascinating experiment, May, about whether or not American consumers can live without products made in China. I mean,
That's
this
what,
is going to be,
and
I mean,
guess
because
what?
Walmart, Target, they don't really exist without China.
Eric, I'm no economist and I'm not a fortune teller, but I can tell you right now they can't survive.
I
They won't be
don't,
able to survive.
I mean, people almost lost their minds when TikTok was about to go away.
Well,
So
exactly, exactly. Well, you saw what
I,
happened during COVID. People were in fistfights over toilet paper. So
I,
imagine if we lose
yeah,
70% of products that are made in China and all of a sudden or
it's,
they become exorbitantly expensive. So you can't even afford it anymore.
and if it's not the main product that you're buying that's made in China, it's the part that serves the main product that you're made
Correct.
in China. So people were talking about even like the agriculture that's grown in California. Okay, that's not going to be tariffed, but the truck that carries the agriculture, the bags that put there in the fruit, the
Right.
stickers those are all made in China.
That's
So
right.
much of our economy has become dependent on
Totally
China. Now,
intertwined. Yeah.
I understand what Americans are saying when they feel vulnerable to so much being outsourced to China. But
Sure.
going back to the first part of our conversation about the fairness question, remember, most of the value went to the Americans. The fact is that we benefited from $3 t-shirts.
Yep.
Okay? I mean,
Yep.
that was a fair deal in many people's minds, was like they take the pollution, they take the crappy job, and we capture most of the value and we get a cheap t-shirt.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the whole ripping off, that's what people out here are just perplexed by.
Yeah. Like,
Because
how can you say that when this is what you want?
this is what you want. And bear in mind, Target and Walmart buyers would continually come into factories in China and say, lower the price,
Lower the
lower
price.
the price, lower the price. And the factory owners would say, if I have to lower the price, I've got to lower safety conditions, I've got to lower my environmental standards. And Target and Walmart and all of these companies would say, that's not my problem. That's a you problem. That's not a
Yeah.
me problem.
Right.
Okay. They negotiated so hard. So then when they turn around and hear that it's not fair, they're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
This doesn't feel right. So I think, and if you look at the trade between the US and China, it amounts to about 14.8, maybe 15% of China's total trade, 524 billion. It's about 12% of our total trade. So there is a thinking in China that says 85% of our trade is not done with the United States. Now, $500 billion for China is a lot of money. There's no doubt. But there is also a new thinking, and this is not just in China, this is in the Financial Times and other places, that says with a few reforms domestically, they can make up $500 billion in their economy. Remember, the Chinese economy is a beast of an economy.
Yeah.
This is the second largest economy. I forget if it's 15, 16, 17 trillion dollars, but it's a big economy. So adding up some reforms could do it. Let me just give you an example of what one reform that could make up for the whole US trade balance pretty quickly if they were able to implement this reform. Americans and Chinese have something in common. We all live one healthcare disaster away from bankruptcy.
Okay.
Right? And it's funny.
True.
I mean, if God forbid, May, that you get, a terrible kind of cancer of some kind, or you get hit by a bus and you need to go to United Health and say, I need tests and I need this and I need that. And this is one of the things that, Luigi, generated so much, passion for, was because
Healthcare. Yeah.
yeah, everybody hates the insurance companies because they suck, right? China is a very similar situation where people save 35 to 40% of their income for health to take care of themselves, their children, and their parents. Now, imagine if China then started to build out a public healthcare system that brought that number down to 5 or 10%. It releases an enormous amount of money into the domestic
Uh,
economy to drive consumer demand. So
sure.
what Xi's got to do is build up domestic demand
Yeah.
so that he's not reliant on the outside world.
Right.
That would
Right.
more than offset the downturn in trade with the United States. So
Right.
that's
Right.
their thinking right now is like, you
Interesting.
want this? And remember, most of what China buys from the US is agriculture, is food.
Agriculture. Yeah. And they
Boeing
can get that
planes,
elsewhere.
soybeans, corn. And right now, as we are recording this, okay, I'm not sure
They've
when you're
already
going to
cut
release it.
deals. Yeah, they've already cut deals with other countries,
There,
haven't they?
there's a senior delegation from China in Brazil negotiating a
Mhm.
massive increase in soy, corn, and meat to
Right.
replace what they're buying from the United States.
Right. Yep.
And guess what? They are never going to go back to the Americans.
No, why would they?
And so
Why would
these dumbass American farmers who think that they're going to get a deal and that the Chinese are going to come back, and they put all their faith in Trump. And I say dumbass because they have placed their bet on the wrong person,
they voted for him?
because they voted for him. And by the way, the farmers are going to get a bailout. So the tariff, May, when you go to Target to buy something
Mm.
and you're going to pay more for it, is going to go to an Iowa farmer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they've been bailed
Which
out
doesn't
before.
seem fair at all to a lot of people.
Yes, but we've done that before.
We did it before. We did a
Yeah.
$28 billion bailout the first Trump, and they're going to get a big bailout this time. But the
right.
key difference, though, and Chinese policymakers will tell you this, why would we be dependent on the Americans when they're just going to threaten to cut us off again in the future with our
That's
food
right.
supply?
That's right.
Right?
So here's the bottom line is the trust is now gone. So why would you ever go back to anyone? It's like a relationship. Why would you go back to a terrible relationship where you were lied and cheated on, right? Unless you love abuse, when you can get a better deal or a better relationship somewhere else. So
That's right.
logically, if China's being very smart in cutting these new deals with Brazil, they cut a deal with Australia as well for beef and other supplies. So they're doing this, and at rapid fire, which is so typical, right? They're shrewd. They
Well,
don't
they
fuck
and they
around.
shifted. So just another, we saw this happen. Australia's gonna is gonna boom. There's no doubt. I mean, and Australia has a tense relationship with China, but last week the Chinese cut a deal to shift $1.5 billion of liquid natural gas purchases, stopping from the U.S., moving to Australia. The Chinese are going to buy more agriculture from South Africa. They're going to shift to Argentina, Brazil, Chile. There are other places for them to buy
Of
what they
course
buy
there
from the
are.
United States.
Of
So
course there
that
are.
is the big problem for the Americans, is that
Yeah.
once this market is gone, then it's going to be very hard for the Iowa farmers and to find a buyer who's as big as the Chinese are.
Right.
And that's going to be the problem for them.
Right. Right. So Eric, do you think I should move?
Well, I mean, you're talking to the wrong person, as somebody who's lived overseas for 25 years now. I mean,
I know. I
I mean,
know.
it is tough. I can imagine it is tough to be in the U.S. I mean, but let's be clear, it's tough to be out here too, in part because the uncertainty that all of this has caused.
Right.
That being said, what's very, very interesting is the day after Xi Jinping was in Hanoi, the Ethiopian prime minister was in Hanoi.
Oh.
And one of the things that we're starting to see is a dynamism in international diplomacy in a way that we haven't seen before. The speed with which the world is reconfiguring around the United States
Right.
is unbelievable.
Yep.
And this is something that is unappreciated in the US because US media is hermetically sealed from any kind of perspectives outside the US.
Yes.
And so one of the things we're seeing is, South African trade delegations coming to Southeast Asia. We're seeing the Colombians launch a new trade route to China. We're seeing, the Emiratis negotiating with Mercosur. We're seeing this is happening, and everybody is motivated by the same fear of we have to reduce our dependency and exposure on the U.S. market. We cannot be, and at the same time, the Spanish Prime Minister was just in Beijing last week, and he came to Vietnam as well. And again, we're seeing a very different attitude from Europe now. Principles are subject to circumstance, right? And so the principles now for Europe are when they're caught between the Russians on one side, the Americans on another side, and then the Chinese present a different kind of threat to them. And the threat is an existential threat to Volkswagen, to Audi, to Renault, to their auto businesses, core industries. but at the same time, it also is an enormous market for their goods as well.
Yeah,
And so it's one of the reasons why you see BMW, Audi, Mercedes, and others deepening their investments in China at this moment, not pulling away the way that the Americans have. So the Europeans are going in a very different direction. It's a high risk, high reward strategy that they're engaging in.
Yeah, but they're left with really no choice because of the
They have no
shakeup,
choice.
right?
That's right.
Yeah, and I've been saying with what Donald Trump has done, it's so self-inflicted, so unnecessary, and it's doing such irreparable damage that I don't think there's any turning back. Like you're saying, once these other new relationships are developed, why in God's name would they ever go back?
And
So
the problem is, let's fast forward to 2028 and imagine,
if we get there.
if we get there, and President Gavin Newsom is kind of settling into the West Wing of the White House,
Okay, interesting.
okay,
All
and Vice President Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is kind of, the problem is that repairing this damage is not going to be easy, because at the end of the day, the Congress is not going to to all of a sudden approve billions to rebuild the education department, billions to put USAID back together. Putting Humpty Dumpty back together again is going to be impossible. Once you've broken this, our political system is not capable of creating things right now.
That's right.
Because we're stuck in this kind of logjam and this hatred of one another.
Yeah.
And then if you're overseas and we've got a new president who says, remember Biden said, America's back, right? Well, they've heard that before now. Mm-hmm. And you told us America was back in 2020, and then look what happened. Now you're telling me America's back again, and I'm supposed to believe you? No.
Right.
No. And remember that word I used at the beginning of our discussion, how people here feel traumatized by what's going on. People are scared. This is not just a geopolitical thing with trade ministers going back and forth. The guy on the street is scared that their job is potentially at stake. And again, they're staring down into the abyss of, if these factories go away, there's not new ones that are going to come.
What are we going to do?
What happens?
Right. Yeah.
What happens to poor developing countries?
So we can start wrapping up a little bit, but I don't want to end on a terrible note. But really, because of one person's doing, because of one person's irresponsible decision making and uninformed decision making,
I push back on that a little bit.
Well, why? Why? Tell me why.
I think Trump is a symptom, not the cause. There is an entire architecture of people, Steve Bannon, the Heritage Foundation, the whole Congress, this is a movement that he in many ways is titular, but this is, one person is there.
He had to be elected to that office in order execute all of this.
That's right. And without Trump, this wouldn't be happening. I think so in that sense, because no one else has the charisma that Trump has to be able to mobilize this coalition and bring all these together.
That's right.
I mean, no one's going to line up behind JD Vance and go, I'm going to do anything JD Vance says, So
I still do say that it is one person who has initiated all of this to create this ripple effect that is going to have immense negative effect on hundreds of millions, if not billions of people.
For the rest of yours and my life, and potentially my son's life. I mean, this is, it took us 30 years to recover from World War II, if not more. And again, we just have to pray to whatever God you believe in, that this type of disruption doesn't lead to massive war, because this type of disruptions at this level tend to do that.
Yes, this kind of instability and uncertainty and fear, people react when they're fearful, right? In not so good ways.
That's right. And again, the warnings coming out of the Chinese spokespeople is, again, they are including a kinetic war. If they're saying, both from their kind of designated, the people who go on TV that they kind of approve to kind of speak to the international media, and their official spokespeople have said, we'll fight a trade war, quote unquote, to the end. But if it leads to an actual war, we'll fight that to the end as well. So that is part of this discussion. And I just hope Americans understand that this is not just a negotiation and, this is unleashed a process that has one scenario. it's not a zero chance, okay, that this does not end in actual contact, and that is something we have to consider, that we're in a very dangerous moment of history right now.
Absolutely. And I'm
And I
glad you
think we
said
have to
that.
be sober about that.
Yes, I think, and I think people need, I keep on saying, please don't bury your head in the sand about this, because this is dead serious.
And Americans, just the last thing, they have this naive notion that if a war is fought with China, that it'll be fought in the Western Pacific. It'll be fought out here in Asia, and that they're so far away from the war.
Right, right.
The Chinese have been actually pretty upfront that if a war with the United States breaks out, the war will be fought on the U.S. homeland. And Americans kind of go, what? How would that be? You know, the war of the 21st century is going to be a cyber war, if anything else. And they're going to launch massive disruptions into U.S. daily life of, 2 to 3 million viruses dropped into LA County. The banking system pulled off, phone systems pulled off, internet cables cut, massive disinformation propaganda fed into it to kind of play on the cleavages in our society. And don't think the Russians would be sitting on the sidelines either, just
That's
idly
right. I was
watching.
just going to say, I'm
Okay,
sure
so we would pull ourselves apart. How long would it take Tucker Carlson or some of the right-wing agitators or left-wing agitators to kind of, start feeding into this? And so within days of an actual fight that begins out here in Asia, the cyber war would start in the US.
Yeah.
And so we would not be immune from any of this. And I just, again, want people to be sober about what conflict with the Chinese in the 21st century means. And it is a very different type of engagement than we've ever experienced. And I don't get the sense that there's a lot of appreciation of that.
No, I don't think so. When you have the vice president calling Chinese peasants, then that's where they're at. That's the mentality, the average mentality here. And so, it's very dangerous.
It's a problem.
Uninformed. Yeah. But, hey, man, I so appreciate the fact that you took time to talk to me about this really important and kind of scary issue. But I think
my pleasure.
Needed.
And I'll just do a little shout out for my team and the work that we're doing. And if people are interested in this work, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. Again, fact-based, agenda-free, independent. We're not funded by any governments or any partisan kind of entities. It's subscribers that fund us. And so we appreciate all of that, and Patreon and things like that. And so we would love, and all of our staff, I'm the only guy from the US and all of this. Everybody else is from the Global South. And so if you want a Global South perspective from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, come and check us out.
For sure. Okay. Well, listen, take care. Say hello to your family for me.
Great. Thank you so much. And I look forward to kind of hearing feedback from your viewers on this.
Absolutely. I'm sure I will be hearing a lot, because I think this is probably more information than they've ever gotten before when it comes to China and the Asian region and the US and history. It's important, people. All right. Thanks, Eric. And thank you, everyone, for joining Shoes Off Inside one-on-one. Of course, follow us on Instagram at Shoes Off Inside MKT, or also on my Instagram, Mei Lee Show. And we're on YouTube too. Subscribe, support us, and rate us. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.